It is one of the coldest, remotest, and most inhospitable places on the planet. But global warming means the Arctic is heating up, thawing out deposits of precious minerals and opening up new oil and gas fields and trade routes. That means the North Pole is increasingly worth fighting over, and each of the world's superpowers are vying for control, none more so than Russia. Vladimir Putin has built dozens of military bases there, poured billions into a new shipping route he hopes will one day rival the Suez Canal, and has laid claim to an underwater mountain range that could contain vast, untapped resources. China is now muscling in on the act, declaring itself a near-Arctic nation and bolstering Russia's activities in the region. Meanwhile, America and her allies are scrambling to respond, welcoming Sweden and Finland into NATO, updating their own bases, and carrying out saber-rattling military drills. This is how and why each of these global powers are now squaring up over the Arctic Circle, what they will be fighting over, and how all of that affects the great game for global dominance that is already playing out further to the south. The Arctic Circle sits roughly 67 degrees north of the equator and is governed by the Arctic Council, a permanent body of 8 nations whose territories sit within or close to it. They are America, Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. Of those 8 states, the so-called Arctic 5 lay claim to some of the polar ice cap as their own, but a lot of these claims overlap. The biggest point of contention is over an underwater mountain range known as the Lomonosov Ridge, which Canada, Denmark, and Russia all say is rightfully theirs. In the past, these claims didn't matter very much, because everyone broadly agreed the Arctic should be off-limits when it came to global competition. In 1987, at the height of the Cold War, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev declared it a zone of peace. And when the Arctic Council was first created in 1991, its mission was all about conserving the environment and promoting cooperation between its members. The island of Svalbard is a symbol of that old world. Located deep within the Arctic Circle, it is Norwegian territory, but houses research stations belonging to a dozen countries, along with the world's largest satellite array and a seed vault which could be used to restart life on Earth. But in January last year, an undersea internet cable connecting this land of brotherly love to the rest of the world was cut. Suspicions immediately fell on Russia, but whoever was ultimately responsible, the message was clear. The game of global dominance, currently at play among the world's superpowers, has, at last, reached the Arctic. So what changed? 2 factors, each of which plays on the other, have brought it about. The first is climate change, and the second is the West's relations with Russia. Back when the West and Russia were last at each other's throats during the Cold War, the Arctic was too frozen to be of much use to either side. So it was easier for both of them to declare it off-limits rather than fight over it. Then, when the Arctic seriously began to thaw during the 1990s and 2000s, Russia and the West were trying to make peace, so they agreed to work together to preserve it. But now, Russia and the West are once again feuding, and the Arctic is less frozen than ever. Those factors combined have kick-started the contest, and there is plenty to fight over. Though it may initially appear to be a frozen wasteland, the Arctic is in fact thought to contain a full 1/5 of the world's untapped oil and gas, and the same amount of valuable minerals such as lithium and graphite. These are essential in making semiconductors, which are the brains of everything from nuclear missiles to satellites, as well as making batteries upon which the world will rely once it transitions away from fossil fuels. The Arctic Ocean is the world's 5th largest and is becoming increasingly fertile fishing ground as the ice breaks up. And it is not just small fishing boats taking advantage. Huge container ships can now navigate these waters, opening up trading routes that get them around the world much quicker than routes that span the equator. One such route, the Northwest Passage, runs from Asia along the top of Alaska, through Canada's Arctic archipelago and into the Atlantic. Another, the Northeast Passage, runs along Russia's Arctic coast before emerging into the North Sea near Norway and Great Britain. All of which means the Arctic Circle is already worth tens of billions of dollars to whoever controls it, and could be worth trillions in the not-too-distant future. It is hardly any wonder, then, that world leaders are queuing up to take a piece of the pie. First in line is Vladimir Putin. Nobody has invested more time, money, or effort in staking a claim to the North Pole than the Russian despot. In 2007, he even sent 2 deep-sea submarines to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean to plant a Russian flag. But his efforts go well beyond symbolic flag planting. He's backing that gesture with a whole lot of firepower. First of all, the Arctic is home to Russia's most formidable navy, the Northern Fleet, which is based on the Kola Peninsula and comprises 24 submarines and about the same number of battleships. That includes all 11 of Putin's nuclear-armed subs and 8 special-purpose craft, like the highly experimental Belgorod, a 600-foot-long, 60-foot-wide monster sub that carries the Poseidon nuclear torpedo. Though it is called a torpedo, this is really a nuclear-powered underwater drone, which the Kremlin says can travel huge distances undetected before exploding with enough force to submerge a country beneath a radioactive tsunami. But the Belgorod also has another role, as a mothership for a fleet of smaller deep-sea dive submarines which are thought to be kitted out for nefarious activities like mapping and sabotaging gas pipes and data cables, perhaps including Nord Stream 2. Very little is known about these smaller subs, which are assigned to an equally shadowy branch of the Russian government called the Directorate of Deep Sea Research. But we do know that one of them, the Losharik, caught fire in 2019. The blaze killed several crew, all of them highly decorated Russian naval officers, and was quickly hushed up by the Kremlin. Alongside the Northern Fleet, Putin has built or refurbished no fewer than 50 military bases inside the Arctic Circle over the last decade, located all along Russia's 1,500-mile northern coast. Some of the main bases are Rogachevo, Nergoskoy, Temp, and Ushakovskoy, which have been equipped with fighter jets, bombers, and state-of-the-art radar defences. Putin has continued building up these forces even while his main army is at war in Ukraine, showing just how important the Arctic is to him. The reason for this is that these forces guard the Northeast Passage, which the Russian leader hopes will one day rival the Suez Canal as the main artery carrying trillions of dollars of global trade from Asia to the West. At the moment, the route is mainly used to transport Russian gas and oil from huge new drilling operations deep within the Arctic to the likes of India and China, which have become Putin's main customers after the West cut him off. The route is tricky to navigate, but is being made easier by a fleet of Russian nuclear-powered icebreakers, and if done successfully, it is far quicker than sailing around the equator, meaning it is also cheaper. The amount of cargo shipped via the route grew more than 10 times in a decade from 2012 to 2022, and Russia expects it to grow by almost as much again by 2035. Experts doubt whether it will ever truly rival the Suez route, but even if it doesn't, it could still be worth billions each year to Russia in transit fees and billions more to the countries using it, China chief among them. Which brings us to the next would-be Arctic superpower. Despite being located almost 1,000 miles outside the Arctic Circle, China has taken a keen interest in the goings-on at the top of the world, and Xi Jinping is doing everything in his power to muscle in on the action. Back in 2013, China was granted permanent observer status on the Arctic Council, having been invited to apply many years earlier in happier geopolitical times. Getting Beijing on the Council was seen as important because, as the second largest emitter of carbon, world leaders wanted China to be responsible for trying to protect the region. Besides, Beijing had long been involved in research projects in the Arctic and owned 2 bases there, one on Svalbard and one in Iceland. One of its icebreaker ships, the Snow Dragon, had set a record by sailing across the Arctic Ocean to Europe just a year before, and it seemed the Chinese deserved a say. But what leaders failed to anticipate at the time was just how interested Xi would become in the Arctic, and that his ambitions would go well beyond simple research. In the years after China became an Arctic observer, Beijing gained access to 2 new space centres, one in Sweden and one in Finland, and poured money into a huge new Russian energy project, the Yamal liquefied natural gas plant. The project gave Beijing a stake in the Northeast Passage, since that's how gas from the plant gets to market, and it began sending its own container ships along the route. It built a second icebreaker, the Snow Dragon 2, which has since sailed the Arctic 4 times, and in 2018 declared itself a near-Arctic state, all of which made America suspicious. Washington began doing some digging and found these innocent-sounding research projects were actually linked via the Chinese Communist Party to the People's Liberation Army, the party's armed wing. While China was contributing to Arctic research, America believes its data-gathering tools are also feeding information to the military to spy on Beijing's rivals, like the weather balloon which was found drifting over the US last year. Washington began to quietly lean on its allies to sever links with China. In 2020, Sweden said it would no longer allow Beijing access to its space station, and shortly afterwards, Finland did the same. Then, in 2022, the White House said loudly that China was exacerbating tensions around the pole and that America would have to respond. Having suddenly woken up to the importance of the Arctic in geopolitics, America found itself in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable position. Dead last in a 3-horse race. The US has 10 Arctic bases, 9 in Alaska and 1 in Greenland, but these are holdovers from the Cold War, mostly designed to detect incoming nukes from Russia and send their own nukes back the other way. Dubbed contingency bases, they are old, in a bad state of repair, and are not best equipped for the new age of Arctic competition. For example, the base at Thule is virtually defenceless and has none of its own icebreaker vessels, which are needed to get supplies in and out during the winter months. In fact, America has just 2 icebreakers in total, a capability which officials admit is limited and deteriorating. China has 2, but is already building a 3rd. Russia has 50. Washington is racing to catch up. It is seeking out new locations for bases which can handle larger military and logistics vessels, and it has plans to build 6 new icebreakers. But all of that will take time. In the interim, America hopes to use its allies in the region to project power on its behalf. And here, it holds a key advantage. Of the 8 Arctic nations we mentioned earlier, 6 of them are currently in NATO, and Sweden is set to join soon, meaning everyone but Russia will be part of the US-led alliance. And they have begun flexing their muscles. In 2022, NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg said the Arctic had become the alliance's Achilles heel and needed to be strengthened. Months later, warplanes from 14 NATO countries, including nuclear bombers, took part in Steadfast Noon, a huge drill on the edge of the Arctic Circle. That was followed by another set of war games, Cold Response, which involved thousands of troops from a dozen nations and was led by Finland, NATO's newest member. And America's allies have begun pushing back on Russia's claim to own the Arctic as well. Way back in 2001, Moscow laid claim to most of the Lomonosov Ridge, that underwater mountain range I mentioned earlier, which would give it rights over any resources uncovered there in future. Then it planted that flag on the seabed. But first Denmark in 2014, and then Canada in 2019, laid claim to the same territory, saying it should rightfully be theirs and presenting evidence to back it up. At the time, this was mostly about political posturing. All 3 countries handed their cases to the UN and agreed to peacefully carve up the territory between them. But that was before the Ukraine war wrecked relations between them. In the wake of Putin's invasion, America and its allies walked away from the Arctic Council, refusing to work with Russia while it was waging a war of aggression in Europe. Outnumbered, Russia turned to China to back its initiatives in the far north, and last year the pair announced new multi-billion-dollar joint mining projects. Another deal to build a huge new gas pipe, the power of Siberia 2, is expected in the future. Now, it isn't hard to see how competing claims over the Lomonosov Ridge could trigger a conflict, particularly if new resources are discovered hiding under the ice. For now, any chances of a direct conflict over the Arctic seem remote, and the region is instead descending into a new kind of Cold War. But, just like the region itself, competition is heating up and could one day spill over into actual fighting. And if it does, the Lomonosov Ridge could be both how and where it all begins.